Hi there. The first journal article that I read was Contemporary Realistic Fiction for Young Adults by Anita Klaas. And it mentions that the most popular type of literature written for young adults is contemporary realistic fiction. I was surprised to hear this, as I was convinced that young readers would normally like to prefer some form of nonfiction that we've been reading about. Graphic novels and biographies have really been making significant strides in recent years, so I'm interested in what my peers think about this. I also like to point out that in the 21st century, readers need to be taught multiple literacies, such as movies, puzzles, gaming, because they're more interactive, like the visual and game literacy is really becoming popular. For instance, I remember as a kid playing some of the first video games that Reverend invented and how many of them had a literacy aspect to them. So it seems like a continuation and evolution of the visual and gaming literacy was kind of imminent. The article also mentions that bullying and war violence have become a very popular theme among young adult readers. I have a bit of a hard time with the violent aspect of this theme. Even though it gets kids reading, I feel like it desensitizes kids to the impact of bullying and violence itself. I mentioned in other responses that I'm not about censorship to touchy subjects, but I feel like where the line should be drawn, I'm not sure, or should there be a line? I don't know. Everybody kind of likes something different. Another point that this article makes is authors use authentic practices such as phonetically written words with a mixture of letters and numerals to form words to keep literature from being dated. This language is relatively a new norm in our modern, no traditional rules acceptance of reading and writing. But whatever gets kids reading is really a good thing. We read for meaning, so is this really even an issue? It definitely adds creativity in developing a unique voice for our young adult audience. The last part of this article that I really had to consider and internalize was it mentions critical thinking. As a teacher, I believe that this is a huge obstacle for students. Many kids struggle with critical thinking and problem solving. They don't seem to have much drive to work independently, and this might be due in part, at least in part, to struggling with traditional reading textbooks, because we do ask a lot of reading out of our boring old traditional textbooks. But yes, critical thinking mostly comes from reading literature because students need to learn to monitor their thinking by asking themselves before, during, and after reading if what they read really made sense, looks right, and sounds right. When they begin to do this, critical thinking develops. The other article I read was Teaching Literature in an Age of Text Complexity by Janet Alsop. This article made a lot of references about the brain and literacy. There are several points that were meaningful to me. One point that the author makes is that we live in a storied world, and I think that's completely true. She mentions that there's an increased emphasis on what are called informational texts and so-called complex texts that may not be beneficial. For young adult readers, the choices and availability of multi-genre texts have much improved since I was a young adult reader. It makes me really wonder about the K-12 Common Core standard, if they're really attempting to restrict what students read. I also agree when the author mentioned that adolescent brains are still under development, like their frontal lobes. And it's possible that reading narratives coupled with discussion and writing have the potential to build the prefrontal cortex and deepen the emotional response along with nuanced, nimble thinking. I think we forget sometimes that our young adult readers are still developing and learning and processing, evaluating, developing empathy when reading through all types of reading mediums and genres that are now available. As far as reading development, our young readers are emotional during these times. With the onset of bullying and violence, these kids cannot often escape it. Social media and violent video games that these students are exposed to, some as early as kindergarten, certainly have an impact on emotions such as empathy. The next article I'd like to discuss is Changing Landscape of Literature for Youth. It's a historical perspective about realistic fiction by Susan Hayward. I really enjoyed reading how fictional stories have changed over the times. Up until 1919, when John Newbery turned the whole perspective of what the child's book should look like with his ideas that kids should be entertained. Literature was for children. Morals, values, and expectations were taught to children through parenting. As an educator, I've seen the shift in content as well as the delivery of realistic fiction texts. This does affect reading and reading development because there are some elements of controversy among society as well as with myself. I really do like that the author mentioned that today children want to construct their interpretations without authors speaking in a moralistic tone. However, as a parent and an educator, what if the subject of a particular novel offends me or may offend someone else? The article mentions the intended age of children's books has shifted. More children are reading books intended for earlier audiences. The young adult readers are no longer high school students, but children in upper elementary and middle grades. That's my point. Blurred lines. Well, there's many of them. What is appropriate to expose our young adult readers to? Traditional happy endings or at least a viable conclusion were the norm. The article mentions that characters in today's books often continue to struggle with problems at the close of the story with no happy ending or a come to their senses resolution, nor is there always a way to find hope at the end of a book. This fact, as a teacher, gives me something to think about as far as reading instruction. The reality of our modern world through the various reading platforms should not be shielded from our young adult readers, but these kids are able to handle realities of some subject with no conclusion as to why things went the way they did. Chapter 4 in our textbook begins with an important discussion on censorship, intellectual freedom, and selection. The difference between censorship and selection of materials is given, and the most censorship efforts are focused on the issue of who should have the authority to select materials. In my experience, this is usually up to the media center specialist or teachers. The author brings up a very good point when they say that there are times that teachers have to rely on review sources, ratings, and awards due to the fact that we simply don't have enough time to read each and every book that we bring into our classroom. I must have a couple hundred books in my classroom and certainly don't have time to read all of them. I wish I could, but I don't. There are times that I've skimmed a book and was really glad that I did because I've come across some inappropriate material for my students. Parents' rights versus censorship is an important section in Chapter 4, as it brings to light that parents do sometimes try to control what their children are reading, seeing, and hearing in school. I found it very interesting that in Virginia there is a group called Parents Against Bad Books in Classrooms. As a parent, I tend to leave the selection of my children's materials up to their teachers. I think that this is a group that would add more stress and work for teachers if it was present where I am employed. The community can also add to the selection process of what materials students are exposed to, and also discussed in the chapter is the history of censorship and how it's really changed over time. The sources and targets of censorship are listed, as well as some of the books that have been challenged over the years. There is a powerful statement in the text that reads, "Censors would like to control the minds of the young. They're fearful that the educational system, because students who read learn to think, thinkers learn to see, and those who see often ask questions." Chapter 5 explores contemporary realistic fiction. The author gives a brief history and background of the contemporary realistic fiction, and we're told of some of the common themes and characteristics of this type of literature. Contemporary realistic fiction takes settings, characters, and plots from the real world and changes the randomness of the world into meaningful patterns. This type of literature can help readers to deal with a plethora of issues that they may be facing. Some of these issues can be are discussed in Chapter 5, and in the concluding thoughts on this section, it says, "Contemporary realistic fiction, or the problem novel, provides young adult readers with an excellent look at other people's lives, their individual challenges, as well as their families and relationships." This type of literature mirrors the world that our young adult readers see. I think that all of the information from this week was a lot, but it was meaningful, and I really enjoyed the articles, and the textbook really helped clarify some things for me. Thank you.